co-chair of Wales's Anti-Poverty Coalition. I mentioned I do a lot of campaigning around child poverty in particular. I'm going to just start off. I think it's really helpful for us to define actually what poverty is, and we're talking about it in terms of what we would understand it to be from an economics perspective, but also in the way that the government and other civil society organisations measure poverty. So the technical definition is one that's based on a household's income. It's measured at a household level. So that means a group of people who live together as a family, really, under one roof. And poverty is there's a line basically where if a household income is beneath that line, then that household is said to be in poverty. So the line is created by working out what the median income is. That's the middle income. If you took all the households in the UK and divided them in half, the one in the middle would be the median income. And then anyone in poverty is if they have 60% or less of that median. So you can see it illustrated with the graphic on the left there. And what you don't often hear in debates about poverty is actually, well, how much money is that? And that's because different households have different poverty lines. So the poverty line for a home that contains just one adult is different to the poverty line for a household that contains an adult and two children, or two adults and two children. So the poverty line changes depending on the composition of the household. So the figures then on the right are the most up-to-date that we have. Basically, this is what 60% of the median income for this type of household would be. And we measure these figures after housing costs, and that's because the cost of housing varies hugely across the country, and it's the same within Wales as it is across the whole of the UK. So really important to look at the money that families have for living. So this is the money that's left over once you've paid for your home, and this is then the money that you need, what we would call disposable income, but really it's about paying, you know, for most people, this would go all on food, on bills, on transport, on childcare, and so on. So in Wales, 23% of the Welsh population live on incomes below the poverty line, below the UK poverty line. So this is obviously a really significant proportion. It's a very high rate. And as we'll go on to see, it affects certain groups in Welsh society much more than others, but there's no denying that we have a very significant proportion of people in Wales living on low incomes. But poverty isn't just a lack of money, and it's very important to understand that harmful is because that lack of money prevents you from participating in society. It prevents you from being able to eat the type of diet, to carry out the kind of activities, and to have the living conditions, the living standards that are sort of customary or typical, and also approved of in society. So the quote there is from Peter Townsend, and this is a very well used definition of poverty, which understands that it's the lack of money that prevents you from being able to live normally, and often that because you can't meet those normalized living standards, you're therefore stigmatized. And a really good example of this is what we would consider to be an average diet or a desirable diet. So 5 fruit and vegetables a day, good quality protein, and particularly when it comes to feeding children. Now, if you're living in poverty, that kind of diet is unaffordable, to be quite frank. And as a result, you may have to fill up your children using food that's less nutritious, but is much cheaper to acquire, to store and prepare. But you will be judged and shamed for feeding your children that kind of food compared to families who are better off and can afford all the fruit and vegetables they want, and to have the time and the space and kitchen facilities and so on to prepare, you know, sort of nutritious cooked from scratch family meals. So that's kind of one example of how poverty makes it very difficult for you to live in a way that's seen as acceptable in your society. And the second quote there is from Ruth Lister, who has, to my mind, written the best books on poverty and is a real inspiration for me. And she says that poverty has to be understood not just as a disadvantaged and insecure economic condition, but also as a shameful and corrosive social relation. So what happens to people when they're in poverty, and whether that's for a short time or a long time, is that they are sort of viewed as being less than, They can be subject to expectations around their behaviour, you know, the way that they live, the kind of attitudes towards low income mothers if they have a glass of wine compared to a middle class mother having a glass of wine, you know, all of these kind of things. The whole of society expects poorer people to behave in different ways to everyone else because they are poor, and this can have very long-term negative consequences, particularly for children who are growing up in poverty. So one of the arguments in terms of talking about poverty and Wales becoming an independent nation is that the poverty line is measured in relation to the UK median income, which is just short of £30,000 a year. And Wales has a lower median income. So if Wales were to become an independent country, our poverty line, because of the way we calculate it, would be lower. So therefore, overnight, we would have fewer people technically in poverty because our poverty line would change, because if we have fewer very high earners in Wales, and as a result, you know, overnight we could just redefine poverty. However, I would caution taking that kind of argument, and that's because it's sometimes more helpful to think about poverty using something called the minimum income standard. So the minimum income standard is based on a research method that asks the wide samples of people in the population, including in Wales, what they think that the average person or family needs to have to buy with their money in order to have an acceptable standard of living. So that is nothing luxurious, nothing frivolous, just the very basics that people think you need in order to be able to live a decent life and to not miss out on things that most people will consider good for you, or, you know, kind of just a decent standard of living, to live with dignity and to be able to participate in society. So the MIS, as it's called, is then added up all of the things that the sort of focus groups agree everyone should be able to have, and it's costed up, and this is carried out every couple of years. The prices are adjusted for inflation, and we have a look then, you know, at whether it is enough that people's incomes meet that MIS. And unfortunately, in Wales, a lot of households, many more households than we technically count as being in poverty, don't meet the minimum income standard. So almost 2/3 of children and nearly half of adults have incomes below the MIS. And this wouldn't go away. This fact would not go away in an independent Wales. We would still have to accept the fact that because of the cost of goods and services and the incomes available to people through work and through benefits, that it's very unlikely that everyone will be enjoying a good standard of living that helps them live with dignity, that helps them, you know, fulfill their potential and keeps them healthy. So you can see some examples of where the MIS sits. This has just been published last week, and there's also a link there, which I'll pop in the chat as well, where you can go and compare your own income and the income of people in your area, and see exactly how the MIS is calculated. But I think this is really important to bring into the debate, because if we're talking about things like UBIs, you know, a UBI of £1,000 a month is not going to be enough to get a lot of people, particularly those with dependents or other costs around childcare, disability and so on, to the minimum income standard, unless they can get income from elsewhere as well. So as I said, you know, we've got to look at the fact that the poverty risk is different for different groups in the population. So these figures are the most up-to-date ones that we have. They run to just as the pandemic was starting. So 31% of children overall, although in some areas obviously the rate is higher and in some areas lower, but important to say that there isn't a single local authority anywhere in Wales with a child poverty rate below 20%. So at least 1 in 5 children, even in our most affluent areas, are living in poverty right now. The rate for the entire population as a whole, all people young and old, is 23%, slightly lower for working age adults and quite substantially lower for pensioners. And when we look then at what we call poverty risk, so this is the likelihood of a family of that particular type is living in poverty, you can see here, I think, the starkest illustration of how our current economy, our current social security system, fails to adequately support certain types of households and certain individuals, and therefore their poverty risk is higher. And these map quite strongly onto pre-existing inequalities. They correlate strongly with issues around ethnicity, gender, disability, and you can see that the poverty risk is so much higher for lone parent households in particular. So almost half of lone parent households in Wales are living in poverty. And very important to note that with the exception of the pensioners, the majority of people in these households are in work. So again, it's the same with lone parents, more than half are in work. And it's just, that they're held back by things like the gender pay gap, they're held back by lower average wages than elsewhere in the UK. They're often having to meet higher living costs. The cost of childcare is extortionate, the cost of transport can be really extortionate as well. So, I do a lot of work on child poverty, and I mean, one thing the poverty data really shows us is that poverty is really, really concentrated in families with young children. So we have a set of welfare policies from Westminster, but also Welsh Government's own policy as well around, supporting families. And in a lot of countries, in fact, in almost all advanced economies, it's completely normal for the government to support households with the costs of raising children, because children are lovely, but they're incredibly expensive. So the Child Poverty Action Group produce a minimum income standard for children every year, looking at the kind of things that you need to spend money on in order to give your child an acceptable standard of living as they're growing up. And it adds up to a lot. So in most countries, you have things like child benefit. In America, Joe Biden's just introduced a child tax credit. In Scotland, they have a Scottish child payment that goes to households and it helps them with those children. And also in many advanced economies, childcare is heavily subsidised or free. In Wales, that isn't the case. So you can see that the risk of poverty is particularly concentrated amongst families with young children, and particularly concentrated in households where they have more than 2 children. So I'm not going to go into kind of all the solutions, because we've got an amazing panel who are going to talk about lots of the things that might need to change. And I think all through the day, we'll be able to come back and think about these things. But the typical ways that you can address poverty would be to raise people's incomes. So that's one way. You can use cash transfers or social security, but also you can look at reducing the costs. So thinking about that minimum income standard, to what extent could the state itself provide for free or subsidise the cost of many of the essentials of life? And we can also then look at redistributing income. So you can change the proportion of people who are living on very low incomes by sharing out money more equally. And there is a fourth, and I didn't include it because I think we'll be discussing that quite a lot, and that is a standard kind of economic answer to poverty is growth. So grow your GDP, the idea that like a rising tide of wealth raises all the boats and that some might trickle down. Now, we haven't necessarily seen that. It's very controversial, and I'll come on really to show perhaps why that might not be the strategy that we need in Wales going forward. But it's worth noting in talking about a future economy, and what the liabilities of an independent Welsh government might be, that the current cost of social protection spending, call it that, at the moment, is that the majority of money that goes into benefits, if you like, or cash transfers to households to prevent poverty is in the form of pensions. And this bill is just going to go up and up and up because we have an ageing population. It's inward migration to some extent in some areas, but it's honestly just, there's a lot of people near retirement age living in Wales right now. We also have a low birth rate, and we have much fewer, relatively much fewer people working and paying tax to support all of these older people. So as well as their, social care needs, health needs, they do have very large pension needs as well. We spend quite a lot on working age social security, including providing support for housing costs. And we have many more families, as I say, who are in work, but their wages aren't enough to live off, to meet the cost of living. Cost of living is very high relative to what people can earn. And we also have quite a large disability benefit bill. We have very high levels of ill health in some areas of the country as well. And that will go up as well as the population ages and more people become disabled through their life course. So the final thing, and I will stop there, is just that this is something that's called the donut. So it's a piece of work that I did with the Anti-Poverty Coalition, and we will be continuing to do work in partnership with a quite wide range of organisations, including Wales Environment Link. But the donut is a way of conceptualising how you can address both climate change and sustainability and poverty and social inequality in a single model. So essentially it's a way of measuring, you know, what you as a whole society and a whole economy, what are you doing, you know, how are you faring in all of these domains. And we produced one for Wales, and if anyone would, you know, like to see what it looks like, it wasn't the best result. So essentially the donut told us that in almost all domains, in fact all of the domains, for the social floor, that is the minimum standard of living that we really want everyone to be able to have, we're not doing well at all. And then on the outer rim, these are the environmental limits. So it's showing kind of Wales's share, if you like, of emissions, things like air quality, diversity loss. We're really not doing very well there either. Twin challenge that we have of ensuring that everyone can have a minimum standard of living whilst living within our limits. And more than anything, I think this shows that at the moment, many people in Wales are over consuming, and our systems absolutely are exceeding the acceptable boundaries of how we should be consuming resources and the emissions we're making. But that growth isn't then translating, or that activity isn't translating into economic well-being for much of the population. So we need to have a really big think about how we can make sure that all of us move into that safe and just space for humanity, really, where we can coexist with everyone having everything they need without excessively damaging the planet that we're living on.